The purpose of this program is to commemorate the fire that happened here in Lockport in 1895. This was a very definitive event for the folks here in Lockport, forever changing the course of history for its economic base, bringing people together to form volunteer fire departments and so on and so forth. It's an incredible story that I think you're going to enjoy through the various interviews and visits that we make in this program. You'll notice the format is slightly different. Many of the people will be just speaking to you and telling you and sharing with you their tales about the fire. Perhaps a family member, or through their research of history, they've discovered interesting nuances and stories to tell. So, with that in mind, picture this. It is August 10th, 1895. It's a pretty hot, dusty day. It hasn't rained for quite a while. You're a resident living just outside of Lockport on a small farm. Perhaps you've been here since 1882 and you've witnessed the waning energies of the I&M Canal. Its economic viability has decreased somewhat. But you also have weathered a financial crisis in 1893. But you have enough money to spend on State Street on this particular day. And you have a long list of things to do. You hook up your horse and buggy and you come into town. Of course, you have the bonnet on if you're a lady, and the requisite boots and so on if you're a gentleman, and you come into town and you open your list of things to do, and by gosh, you're going to make a stop at a drugstore that day. Also on your list, you want to make a grocery stop at the local concern. And you know, those boots you've been wearing, they need repair, and you happen to stop off at the local bootery, also on State Street. Last but not least, your horse needs some new shoes as well, so your horse trots down with you to the Edelman livery. And your last stop on your list of things to do is you're going to stop off at the Norton Grain and Feed Store, located at 10th and State Streets. Beautiful limestone building. And you want to buy some nails and so on, and perhaps some seed, because it's also not only a grain and feed store and seed store, but a building supply. You come into the building, you're making your purchase of whatever, and all of a sudden there's a loud ruckus immediately behind your building. Something has gone amiss, and people are starting to come out into the streets. Thus the onset of the fire on August 10th of 1895.
Well, in 1895, Lockport, the downtown, consisted of a number of buildings at various heights and various substance made of things: wood, frame buildings, stone, brick, and some had a cast iron front. And it was, of course, the only shade was awnings, and a lot of walkers on the streets. The street itself, State Street, it was very broad, and I don't think it was paved then. It's 100 feet, over 100 feet wide, which is very unusual in 19th century towns to have such a wide main thoroughfare. And on the east side of State Street, I think it was more developed, and on the west side, the buildings were varied, and some were just one-story frame buildings. So they were not anywhere near as permanent as the ones on the east side, which is still true today to a certain extent.
Well, it's probably like so many other towns. I think the town was about 3,000 people around that, and it must have been somewhat of a busy town. Saturday morning, so if it's like these Saturdays, a little less busy than on regular days. And I don't know what else to say. Horse and buggies. There was a streetcar that ran through town, and I know this fire started early in the morning, somewhere between 10 and 11 o'clock, and then by 1 o'clock it was pretty much had done most of its damage. So that turned out most of the people, I think, that came down to sort of gawk, and also a lot of them helped to try to put the fire out.
As a child, one of the most interesting stories that I would love to hear was that of the fire. I mean, it seemed that that was one of those decisive moments in the history of Lockport that certainly physically changed the face of the city, but also was one of those benchmarks that people would always reference, kind of like the tornado in '65 in more recent history. My family lived on State Street between 8th and 9th Streets on the east side in one of the two original canal contractors' houses. They were right next to the library. So they were very close to the fire.
My grandmother, Christina Girl, was born in April of 1891 and died here in 1971. She lived here her entire life and raised 4 children, and I still have many aunts, cousins, uncles, many relations here in town. As a matter of fact, my grandmother was the first female Italian baby born in Lockport. That was the story that went through, so I believe it. My grandmother remembers it was very hot and windy that day in August, and after the fire started, her father came home and took her mother, brothers, and herself across the I&M Canal to the west side so they would be safe, and they spent the night with a relative over there. But she does remember the flat railroad cars coming down from Chicago, carrying the pumpers and unloading them, and then they pushed them up 9th Street Hill to fight the fire.
From what I know from the fire, there was a history that was researched by Dick Dystrup, who was one of our trustees, our fire district trustees, who teaches government at the Lockport High School. And he and his class researched the fire department and were able to dig through old records and find out that the fire started, it was a very hot, dry summer, and there was a tinner by the name of Frank Miller who was apparently melting some metal to solder a joint or whatever in the Phoenix newspaper building. And somehow during this process he caused the fire to start, and the fire promptly escalated and went from one building to another building.
Based on reports in the newspaper and probably whatever, how valid those things are, it seemed like it started out somewhere, like I said, between 10 and 11 o'clock. And it must have been because it was extremely dry and because there was they always mention the southwesterly winds that were blowing. And this man by the name of Frank Miller was working up on the roof of the McDonald building, which housed the Phoenix, I think it was called Phoenix newspaper, and accidentally dropped some, what they call a firebox or perhaps some coals, and this ignited the, I guess, a tinder-dry timbers up there, and it started on fire and then just swept like wildfire from building to building to building.
Obviously, the weather had been very dry for a long time in August, and on the building next to this building, in fact, the McDonald building, which there on the 3rd floor was the Phoenix newspaper, and they were repairing the roof, and the tinner, I guess, was Miller, and somehow or other, whatever he was doing started a fire on that roof, and it very quickly spread. Not to this building, and jumped past this building, but spread north along State Street.
Well, unfortunately, at that time, Lockport did not have their own fire department, and they realized that they had a fire of great magnitude, and so they summoned help immediately, and the Joliet Fire Department responded within a half hour. They also put out calls to the Lamont Fire Department and to the Chicago Fire Department, and Lamont agreed to come, and for reasons again probably unknown, and we'll never find out exactly why, but the Alton Railroad refused to haul the equipment from Lamont to Lockport. But the Chicago Fire Department did respond by rail. It took them 3 hours to get here, and they brought equipment and fire hose to help battle the fire.
I think they thought they had pretty much had got not that they had gotten it out, but it had it somewhat under control. And this one story related that some old man came running up and said, "The school's on fire, the school's on fire." And what had happened is some other burning embers had, carried by the wind, had gone over to the clock tower of the school, which then ignited that thing and burned it inside out, basically.
It spread north along the east side of State Street, and then it jumped across the street to 9th Street, and then moved east on 9th Street to eventually consume the school, which is where the present Central Square is.
Burned in through the night for a couple days and caused thousands of dollars of damage, but fortunately no casualties.
What was interesting is that the original school, built in the 1850s on the square, had a tower with a clock, and that was the town clock. It, of course, fell with the fire.
People were really scared, and it was a panic situation, I understand, with this fire. You know, they figured they were losing the whole town. And if it wasn't for Chicago Fire Department sending help down on the train, I think they probably would have lost, you know, the whole town. But there's a little story that there was one of the Chicago firemen that came. They said that, he got overcome with the heat, and the people kind of took care of him and were feeling sorry for him, and I guess his uniform got pretty messed up, or whatever he was wearing. So people chipped in to get him a new uniform, and that was just a little tidbit that I had read about some of the history.
She remembers seeing the flat railroad cars coming down from Chicago carrying the pumpers, and they unloaded the pumpers and then pushed them up 9th Street to fight the fire. And that's really about all she remembers, because she was so young, but I remember those vividly. She told me them ever since I was a little girl.
They called Joliet, and Joliet sent up a chemical truck or whatever, I'm not sure if it's a fire engine, that probably did very little good, but at least they sent some help. One of their steamers, that they called it, had been already put out of commission by a previous fire at one of the iron mills about 3-4 weeks earlier, so that was probably their best thing, and it wasn't available. Lamont couldn't send down theirs because the Chicago and Alton Railroad sort of refused to send one of the fire engines down on its tracks. There was some dispute over that. But somehow or another, the Chicago Fire Department sent down, I think, 2 brigades down, and they record how fast it was. They got down here in like 47 minutes. And then I think started pumping from the canal, the little canal, the I&M canal, and tried to basically contain the fire. You know, and I think they probably did a pretty good job. And then they had they had like bucket brigades of citizens in the town that were wetting this side of the street, the west side of the street, so that those buildings would not ignite. And they were saying they were blistering and the window panes were cracking, but they apparently kept them wet enough.
There's also a record that Mr. Hiram Norton, that owned the Norton building, had his own water system. And from what we can gather, he wouldn't let anybody else use the water to protect the other buildings. And having a little bit of a fire background, probably really what happened is that there was only adequate enough protection to protect his own building. Being a small water system, a private water system, that was probably the case. So I'm sure it wasn't a case that he didn't want to share. It was probably a case that there was insufficient pressure to protect more than just his building. So he was able to protect his building, and fortunately his building survived the fire.
Fact was, of course, there was no central water supply, and in fact the city itself had an engineer working on this at the time of the fire, and when the fire was over, they did begin constructing it. The one supply of water that would be available, of course, was the canal.
The big problem was in the town is that they had been debating whether or not they should improve the water pressure and the water supply to be able to contain a fire if it did happen. Well, I don't know what happened on the city council's part, but they never accomplished that. So as a result, they couldn't fight this fire at all. They could get no water pressure at all. And probably it seems like that this would have happened anyway. They probably the fire was greater than whatever ability they had to do it.
Nortons, who owned this building and the Norton building on the canal, had some sorts of water supply. And although the story was told that they wouldn't allow it to be used except to protect this building, the newspapers' accounts seemed to differ from that and said that their outlet was melted because of the high heat, so they didn't have any alternative to helping the rest. The big problem, of course, was the need for a pumper, and eventually that would have to come from Chicago, and it's only with a pumper that you can get enough. It's a steam-driven pump that you get enough water from the canal or any other place to handle a fire of the magnitude of the one that occurred in August 10th.
The Norton building, which is, most people would associate it with Miller's Hardware now, but it's on the corner of 10th and State Street. And that building was saved because Mr. Norton had a water supply and drenched his building with water and saved it from catching on fire. But all the other buildings, which had no water, went up in flames.
The paper makes a big thing. The contemporary accounts of this, the arrival of the pumper, which was put on a railroad flat car from Chicago, and within a couple hours was down here. And a pumper, as I said, would be very important because you're dealing with a water supply that's well below ground level from the canal, and you have to pump it up. When after the fire, they would establish reservoirs, but they were all higher than the downtown area, so gravity could feed it.
In response to the fire, the volunteer fire department was established, and so that kind of volunteer spirit, you know, the community coming together to rebuild and decide that they really need to provide long-term protection, and so the fire department was established.
The mayor at that time, Mayor McDonald, appointed himself the first fire chief. Obviously, he recognized the need to take control of the situation and to try and get together a fire department. And he procured 3 hose carts and positioned them at various ends of the town. And they had a whistle system whereby if there was a fire, they would blow a whistle, and they knew that if the whistle was, if they would blow the whistle so many times, it was designated for a certain cart, and then that cart would respond to the fires.
My family has been involved since the beginning of the fire department. My grandfather, Frank Miller, and then my dad, Bill Miller, and my brother, Jim Miller, was a fire chief, and he retired in 1987. And my son, Gary, is paid on call at the present time, so we've had 4 generations. And I also have a son who's a fire chief in Batavia, Illinois. Besides lots of uncles, my husband was a volunteer, and my one uncle, Bill Clark, was, he was a fireman for 35 years, and he was the chief of the Lockport Fire Department for 30 years. So I think it's in our blood.
And my great-grandfather, George Edelman, whom I never knew, he died in 1945, was one of the founders of the fire department. In fact, I believe he was the first chief, but I'm not certain, but played a leadership role really until his death in 1945. This photo from 1931 shows the firemen's parade at State Street near the corner of 10th and State. My great-grandfather is on the horse to the left. The little boy that you see off to the side near my great-grandfather, in fact, is my father, who was following his grandfather during the parade. So there was a long involvement on the part of my family, both my mother's and father's sides, in the fire department.
So Jonathan, who came to Lockport, Will County in the 1870s, is interesting in and of himself, but his family, his son Leon, became the first fire chief in the city of Lockport, self-proclaimed, I believe. And so there's an interesting result, the connection that the fire began in Jonathan's Phoenix building, spread and burned a good portion of the downtown, and then his son, who soon after the fire became the first fire chief of Lockport.
In the early parts, they were horse-drawn carts. Sometimes the hose carts were actually pulled by the firefighters themselves. They weren't even horse-drawn; they were people-drawn. But some of the earlier photographs we've seen of substantially sized fire equipment, it was pulled by horse, and some of the early pumps were hand pumps. And I think some of the familiar names that we have in town today. George Edelman was one of them, Mr. Miller. There was also Joe Drick, and there's a Joe Drick that's a deputy chief in Joliet, and I'm not sure whether they are relatives, but I'm sure that just the name Joe Drick, the fact that they're both chiefs and they're both Joe Drick, I'm sure there must be some family tie there.
right after the fire, when it was first formed, the fire department, they were behind the bank, the old bank building on 9th. There's an alleyway, and then the next building was called the Highland Building at that time. And they had, they stored like, it was horse-drawn at that time. And they had a fellow by the name of Patrick O'Brien. They hired him. Well, he didn't have too much to do, so then they ended up having him pick up the garbage so that he'd earn his keep, I guess.
I believe our first paid firefighter goes back all the way to 1910. His name was Pat O'Brien. And they felt that it was important to have someone around the clock. And from the history that I read, it sounded like he just basically lived at the firehouse. So he was there pretty much 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there weren't as many fires checking back in you know, the early 1900s, late 1800s. I think people were just more careful then in terms of fire hazards, etc. And so the city felt that after a period of time, he was sitting there in the firehouse, and I think that people felt that he really wasn't being useful enough. And the city felt that way, obviously, because they decided to make him the first city garbage collector. So he had a dual role. I mean, as well as firefighter, he was also the garbage collector.
One thing that I think is interesting is that many communities across the country experienced fires. I mean, it wasn't unique to Lockport. And of course, the most famous, at least for us here in the Midwest, was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And they often were really defining events, certainly in the history of Chicago. I mean, the phoenix is now part of the symbol of the city, the logo. The whole idea that there was this rebirth and that it rose from the ashes to become the second largest city in the country. I remember my great-grandmother, Catherine Edelman, telling me that as a young girl, she sat on the back porch of her family's home and watched Chicago burn. That you could see, I don't know if literally the flames, but certainly the billowing smoke this far away. Boston had a major fire, and on, just about every city. And so for Lockport, I think it played that same role. I mean, it did a tremendous amount of damage, but more than that, I think it helped bring the community together in a very dramatic way, as oftentimes natural disasters do, and got people to work together to rebuild and to provide the kind of support and protection that long-term a community needs.
Jonathan owned a number of buildings downtown. He was relatively prosperous in his later years. Had a number of newspapers that were regional as well as local. The Phoenix, which was housed in the building just east of where we're sitting now. And actually, that's where the fire began, as I'm sure people have told you, on the roof being retarred. He lost, as you've researched, quite a bit. In fact, probably the most devastated by the fire, approximately $30,000 uninsured.
Surprisingly, the ones that had the least insurance were some of the biggest operators in buildings downtown. Others that had smaller operations did have some insurance. So there was about, I think about 30 to 40% of it was insured, of the losses. Despite that, though, there was almost immediately reconstruction being done.
The building that I have restored just north of us here, the McDonald building, which we call it, burnt down basically to the foundations, but they did rebuild a good portion of the building on the original foundations and incorporated some of the debris that was left over from the fire. We have an interesting I-beam that supports the front facade that was charred. It's still, you can see the charring on the edges. Right now there's a signboard covering it, but when we did the restoration you could see it. It
started on one of his buildings and burned another one, but he was able to rebuild almost immediately. I don't know what, they probably borrowed the money or got it some other way, and he must have had a lucrative business downtown to be able to rebuild immediately. Jonathan, in fact, the one who lost the most, rallied the local citizenry to not give up, that, you know, let's rebuild from the ashes. And so he continued printing papers, came back here and was printing papers, painting
for himself. I think he had a small garret on the second floor in the front where he did some of his painting and his still lifes that he's so known for from his days of the gold rush. To connect with Styx, Jonathan McDonald, he painted the view of the Norton building that we have approximately 1880, and that was from the second story of the McDonald building on State Street. And you get a wonderful pastiche of what was going on downtown Lockport at the time. The wooden sidewalks, the horses, the horse troughs for watering the horses.
When the fire occurred, if it occurred maybe 3 or 4 years earlier, it might have been a very much different story, because there probably wouldn't have been the capital available to rebuild. But it did occur at that time when the country was rebuilding. A big operation here was the building of the sanitary and ship canal, which was going full speed ahead in 1895. All those things collectively helped to rebuild the town. One of the interesting things that appears is that before the fire, there were about, on this street between 9th and 10th on State, there were about 8 saloons. After the fire, there were only 6, and they would keep declining as the city became more and more convinced that there were too many saloons in the town.
When you look at the buildings that were burned, there were, I think, two in that area that were saloons. So there must have been quite a few drinkers in a town of 3,000, you know.
The thing was, there was no lives lost, and that, and I think the other aspect of it was that the city rebounded back from it much better than it was before. I mean, the structures downtown and everything were better built and so on than were before. So it's not, that's why they celebrated. I mean, you wouldn't think they'd be celebrating a fire, but that seemed to be not so much a catastrophe as a sort of real opportunity to rebuild, including everything, including the school, which was much bigger than the present Central Square, which is much bigger than the old school.
Fire Day was the celebration of the anniversary of the Great Lockport Fire, or as one of the newspapers put it, the greatest fire ever known in Lockport. And it seems that they celebrated the 5th anniversary, and then the 6th, and the 7th, and by the time they got to the 8th, interest was kind of waning, and that was kind of the end of it. This would have been 1900, 01, 02, and 03.
The picnics that the fire department used to have, and that was really good for the community. They usually had those around August the 10th, the anniversary of the fire.
They started off with a parade, and the parades generally started at 1 o'clock, and the businesses in the area would close at 1 so everybody could turn out for the parade. And they had, of course, the firemen, who were the heroes of the day. And on the 1901 celebration, which I took some notes from here, from the film at the library, they had new uniforms for the occasion, the firemen that is, and they had a hose wagon on order, and they were hoping that would arrive. Now, no mention was made of it in the follow-up story, so maybe it didn't make it for the parade. But, they had people they had a couple of brass bands, and they had the firemen and the policemen and all the dignitaries of the town.
So it seems appropriate today, that we celebrate the centennial, and hopefully some of that same spirit can be revived. It's here already, I think, but Lockport rebuilt quickly. It's remarkable. And we wouldn't have the kind of historic district that we have today if it weren't for the fire.
When we talk about the fire here in Lockport, we certainly would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that there is still visual evidence of the fire that you can see here in Lockport. And behind me is a brick wall located here at 916 South State Street in a building owned by Tom and Lynn Sperling that evidences this particular event. Because as we look at the brick wall, starting at the top, and as we move actually throughout the entire presentation here, we see the charred, gray, smoky look to a lot of the brick, and this, of course, is where the flames were leaping up against the wall. We can also see other brickwork that interfaces with this rather rough brickwork, which is evidently where another building was attached to it. We do know that this particular building had been evidently a jewelry store and a bouterie back in the early days. So here we see today in 1995 evidence of the fire, and we can enjoy, of course, this beautiful building today 100 years later. Which brings to mind what State Street looks like today. Needless to say, after the fire, as Mr. Lamb had mentioned, we see a rebirth in building and new structures going up that were bigger and better, more built in a more solid fashion. Most of the buildings were built in a Greek Revival style. Many of the buildings that had been built before the fire were also of that style. That style is characterized by the following things. First of all, the building has a very strong vertical presentation. Normally, there is a pediment that appears either above the door or at the very top of the building, which is a triangular shaped presentation. Normally, surrounding the doors, we see columns or pillars that are used as decorative elements, adding to that vertical feeling. There's usually a lot of cornice work, too, made out of either wood or masonry that one can see in this style of building. So as you walk down State Street, take some time and take a look at the beautiful details that we now can enjoy. And of course, we might recall, too, that and mention that Lockport Main Street's efforts here in Lockport are about preserving these beautiful details, these aesthetic nuances that help to make Lockport unique.
I think a lot of the buildings they worked on, they improved, they added on to, they tore down what was not going to be stable, and they added to them. You can see inside of many of the buildings that there are scars from the fire, and I think that some of the buildings that you see today have new exterior details, yes, but they follow the same type of structure that started there to begin with. We're at 905 South State Street, which used to be a hotel and boarding house, but now houses Canal House Antiques. And it was built in the 1850s, and it survived the fire, as did its neighbor next door, which is 903 South State, and that houses today the tattoo parlor. This is just the underneath part of the building, the working part, but it was covered with lath and plaster, and the entire interior of this building was covered with lath and plaster, and they painted various stripes and scenes on it and everything, and it was probably used for the traffic on the canal or railroad traffic, people who came to stop and in Lockport to either visit or to work on the canals.
While we lost some early and important buildings, those that replaced them are almost the signature of our historic district. This row of wonderful 1890s masonry buildings, most of which still retain their original cornices, and that's such a rare survivor.
You know, tracing our roots and reflecting on the past, especially an important event like the fire 100 years ago, I think you see proves to be a very important event in our lives and phenomena. We can look back and see the brave people who decided to reform and provide their energies in the form of a volunteer fire department, evolving into a very wonderful system that we have here today in Lockport. And had it not been for those early efforts, where would we be today? We've learned about the early merchandising efforts of someone like Mr. Norton and Stix McDonald. We've heard about the Rodigero family, an Italian family who came to Lockport. We've learned, in fact, that there are several buildings here in Lockport that still evidence the fire, the seared remains of the bricks, and other buildings that predate the fire. And if only those buildings could talk the tales they could tell.
The focus in the fire service today is very much in the area of fire prevention, and we feel the best fire is one that never starts. And so we have programs throughout the year where we especially target the young people and try to teach them fire prevention at an early age, and hopefully we never have to have a fire truck respond to their home.